Michael, Jean-François, thank you very much for coming to Exeter and to talk about your book, World of the Right. You're two of the co-authors, Radical Conservatism and Global Order. And thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you, Gregorio. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Likewise, it's been a wonderful journey here, and we had a nice little walk in town, and we're very pleased to be able to come and talk to you today.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit about the book, how it came about, what are the origins of this project, and what is its central argument and key contributions you want to make?
Absolutely. I mean, the first thing I should say is that this is a book that we have written with 6 people. So to some extent, obviously, today you're going to get the views of Jean-François and myself more than all 6 of us. But hopefully we can provide a sense of the general arguments. I think for me, the origin of the book, and I suspect for Jean-François it's the same thing, came out of our earlier work on neoconservatism. So taking a look at world politics around the turn of the millennium, the George W. Bush administration, looking at the way in which a particular brand of militant conservatism had come to have an enormous influence on American politics and from American politics to world politics. And of course, neoconservatism then met a rather sticky end in Iraq and a variety of other places. And there seemed to be a moment at which the liberal world order, as we've come to call it, was ascendant. And conservatism simply faded from the scenes. But it was our sense that, in fact, there was something much deeper going on the conservative side of politics, and that involved some really fundamental rethinking and some really fundamental realignments, and the reemergence of ideas that we really hadn't seen for probably half a century. Some of these ideas can be linked back to very distinct intellectual traditions, paleoconservatism, various forms of conservative nationalism. Some of them can be linked to what certain thinkers call the old right. And it was this kind of genesis of ideas that we thought we could see bubbling under the surface of what looked like a right that had either become very mainstream or, in fact, had become almost politically irrelevant. And that in fact, was going to set the agenda for politics on the right, or at least had a very good chance of doing so. And we think that's precisely what's happened. The basic argument of the book is that to understand today's right nationalism or populism or whatever term we want to use to call it, we really need to understand it in its global as well as its national dimensions. There's absolutely no doubt that the contemporary right is nationalist. But its form of nationalism, its form of national mobilization, really can't be understood outside of its integration or its relation to the global. And that, we think, is really, really important, because to some extent it is a reaction against globalism. And globalism not simply as an economic process, but in fact as an entire social process and a shift in the power in modern societies. So when the contemporary radical right talks about globalism, they're not simply referring to free trade, they're not simply referring to Davos. What they're referring to is the emergence of what they would call a new class or a new elite, which they argue functions globally, moves through circuits of power that are both national and global, and that has fundamentally transformed the structure of power in liberal directions. And it's only by coming to terms with those transformations at both the global and the national level that a form of national conservatism can actually find purchase in the contemporary world. And our argument is that mobilizing this vision of the world is precisely what they've done, and precisely what they've done extremely successfully.
Thank you very much. So you've touched upon already its critique of globalization and globalism. In fact, in the book you argue that the radical right today is global, and that it acts and thinks also, and not only critiques, globally. Tell us more about this global dimension of the radical right and whether it is a distinctive feature, you think, of today's right. Because I'm also wondering whether the right was always global or at least internationalist and had this internationalist dimension and had a thought about international order already in the past.
Yes, thank you, Gregorio. Yes, I mean, I think that's correct. First thing we must acknowledge that there's always an antecedent to this. I mean, I think that in many ways one could argue that there's been in the past some fascist internationalism, there's been some kind of transnational connection between different forms of radical right, fascist groups, radical conservative groups. So a lot of this is about questions of question of intensity. It is a lot more focus on the international global dimension than previously before, but also in a different way. Okay, arguably here, the radical right today seeks to unify socially and culturally and geographically disparate groups, sometimes on the right, sometimes on the left, through specific understanding of their marginalization by liberal practices and agencies. Okay, there's a kind of anti-liberal agenda that goes in here. An agenda that is in itself an anti-liberal agenda that is globalist in its ways of interacting with different actors and thinking about itself and what it's trying to do here. Now, and this is not here, I guess what we're trying to say here is that what we're seeing since, depends where you want to start, in the so-called populist moment, say 2008, 2016, it's not just an upsurge of different nationalism that are somewhat separate and kind of concerting something together, but really something that goes earlier on, that starts, we kind of date it roughly to the 1970s, where a way of thinking about politics, increasingly here where the right, in particular local intellectuals, in particular ideologues in some places, start thinking about politics and realizing that in order to get anything done in the old language of international politics, domestic politics, the right has to operate, think through, and act globally, and to undermine the liberal international order as we have it in order to pursue their own domestic agenda. Right? That ultimately, increasingly now, everything here has to be global in that sense. Now, so the right in that sense thinks about its mission, thinks about its enemies, thinks about its project, thinks about different imaginaries, what the world might look like differently, and so on, in ways that completely transcend all the categories of domestic, international, in ways that tap into the transnational, the global, also at different levels. But it's also, of course, in the most kind of basic way, increasingly networked, right, transnational, at different level of governance, local, national, transnational, international, and global, in many ways. So these connections are taking place. But the most interesting thing for us is the ways in which the global constitutes, right, the thinking of those intellectuals. Right? The global is part of how they relate to their own experience, sometimes by looking at, we've got a passage at some point that Rita put in somewhere where basically you've got two right-wing individuals from Tennessee visiting South Africa to try to understand how white South Africans feel like they're being increasingly marginalized as white minorities, and then they kind of look at this and think, well, something very similar is happening in America here, where we're both facing some form of white genocide. Right? And so the experience of others increasingly sort of they start thinking about their own experience by comparing themselves and thinking through the categories that are obviously experienced in different ways in different parts of the local. But ultimately they can relate, right? They draw some kind of equivalence between their own thinking and their own situation with that other forces that are being marginalized. And a great deal of what ideologues on the right are doing, a great deal of what these intellectuals are doing is to try to develop a form of political consciousness, right, that is global in that sense. No one here is trying to, at least the most cerebral of them, right, don't think that globalization can be put back in the box. No one thinks that the global is going to go away. It's part of late modern life. It's here to stay. The question is how do we, from the right's perspective, how do we get control of it? How do we manipulate it to our own advantage? How do we redirect that politics, that world that in liberal modernity has brought into being in a much more right-wing conservative direction? And so in that sense, this is what the book is really about, at least for me.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and you've already touched on a couple of themes that I wanted to explore in my next questions around the role of intellectuals and production of ideas, basically, and ideologies. Because in fact, the book is less concerned, let's say, with social movements or far-right fringes, but more concerned with intellectuals as such, the intellectuals. Radical right intellectuals, which come in many shapes or forms, as you highlight, paleoconservatives and the New Right in France. And connected to this, in fact, you make a counterintuitive connection between the Italian Marxist social and political theorist Antonio Gramsci and the global right. You do not only use Gramsci and his ideas about hegemony, counter-hegemony, ideology and intellectuals, common sense, to understand the global right, but you also suggest that the radical right and radical right intellectuals themselves use Gramsci's ideas to make sense of their world and their political action within it. Can you expand a little bit on that? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Thank you, Gregorio. I'll try to get it started, and Michael will fill in there. So this is something that's been going on for a little while. I mean, back in the 1970s, and arguably, I think this is if you want to observe where this starts, it's probably one of the best places to see it. It's with the series of seminars of the French Nouvelle Droite, led by people like Dominique Venner, Alain de Benoit, Mario Tarqui at the time, who basically began to try to rethink a strategy for the radical right after, of course, fascism, after the Second World War. In many ways, this is the post-kind of 68 France context here. It's an effort to try to sort of reinvent a politics for the radical right that is somewhat accepting democracy as a fait accompli, something that you've got to deal with. And so you can see here, and increasingly, the right is turning to what has the new left done? Right? How is the new left reinvented itself? What kind of strategies did they take? And in many ways, one thing that it did do look at is the question of culture, the question of hegemony, of course, and of course they see Gramsci as being central to a lot of how the left has thought about these things. Okay. But not just Gramsci, right? The Frankfurt School, Marcuse is quite present in those readings of Marcuse of the time, Adorno, Cameron, a lot of that. Lenin, Althusser, right? But Gramsci is perhaps the most kind of sort of amenable to kind of a quick sort of reading and that can sort of be articulated into a kind of counter-strategy, counter-hegemonic strategy. So a lot of this starts in that context. Now, how closely do they actually read Gramsci? I think that's up for debate. I think that a lot of it is quite instrumental, cherry picking, and obviously but also quite effective. Right? One of the key points here is the question of, how do you? Part of the problem is, as they perceive it at the time, is that mainstream conservatism has adopted and assimilated the language of the liberal left. Right? And that basically conservative can never actually really break out of that kind of liberal sort of framework because it's using the language and conceptual categories of the left. Right? And so that, with the kind of Gramscian counter-strategy, this idea is that the radical right can break away, develop its own term. Right? So wage a war on culture, a war of words, a war of concept, re-articulating common sense, if you like. I'm quite familiar with this in things called theory. So that happened in France. Quite interestingly, you see something very similar happening in the United States. Maybe, Michael, you can tell us a bit more about San Francisco in that context.
Sure. I mean, you see this happening all over the place. And one of the reasons you point out that a lot of this book is focused on intellectuals. And just to be clear, we don't want to make the argument that the radical right is a primarily intellectual movement. There are a lot of things going on here. But we do want to make the argument that it is not an or an anti-intellectual movement. That in fact, we really can't understand it except by understanding that it takes ideas extremely seriously. And since at least the 1970s, it has developed an entire series of networks and an intellectual edifice, a series of indeed intellectual networks that desire to dominate the world of ideas and the world of culture, or at the very least, to produce a series of ideational structures, ideological structures that can compete with those of liberalism. So I think this is absolutely central. Jean-François talked about this happens in many, many places, very interestingly, all roughly at the same time. In the United States, its primary exponent is a guy by the name of Sam Francis, who's been dead for several decades now, but was a very controversial, very interesting public intellectual newspaper columnist. And Francis argued that, and one of Francis's main people who he influenced in this way was none other than Breitbart, right, the inventor of the infamous Breitbart News back in the day. The argument that politics is downstream from culture, that it's only by winning a cultural battle that you can win political battles, and that it's essential, therefore, to be able to frame your political struggles in ways that resonate culturally, in ways that can mobilize culturally. And crucially, and we think this is a very, very important part of what this new Gramscianism has done on the right, to feel comfortable with a language that the traditional mainstream right was very uncomfortable with, which is the language of class. So one of the most striking things, if you look at the contemporary right, is how comfortable it is talking about class, how comfortable it is talking about its ability to mobilize elements or entire classes, the disenfranchised working class, to use just one of the cliched examples, to this end, and the use of explicitly Gramscian ideas in order to make that happen. So this is a Gramscianism that is not simply about cultural mobilization. It's also trying to link up cultural mobilization to a particular kind of sociology of modern life, which again links back to the ideas that we were talking about earlier about the dislocations of economic globalization. That if you're looking to mobilize a population, you need to understand, A, who the people can be who are that you want to mobilize, how they can be mobilized, and you need to develop a set of cultural strategies for doing that. And I think it's quite evident that over the last 2 decades, they have been increasingly successful and increasingly adept at doing this.
Thank you very much. To conclude, I'll inject some of my also sort of personal interests and research. I've been one strand of my own research has focused on the resurgence of civilizational discourses and imageries in modern politics, also as a form of critique of globalization and the liberal international order. In a sense, I think a lot of international relations and the debate have been somewhat prisoners of the Fukuyama versus Huntington debate in a way or another. And I see that in your book, the final chapter precisely engages with this issue and highlights how today the radical right is actually even more civilizationist than nationalist in some ways, and found this very, very interesting. I'm curious to know a little bit more because you identify some cleavages within the right, some that focus mostly on Europe, some that focus more broadly on the West. And so I'm interested to to hear more about that and for you to expand on this.
Thanks, Gregorio. Once again, this is an area that is fraught with distinctions, but also with misunderstandings. And I think one of the most interesting and important elements of the contemporary right is its attempt to articulate a civilizationalism which is very, very different from those that it associates with the old right, what it would consider to be the old right, particularly the fascist old right. That is a hierarchical vision of civilization, or even worse, a universalizing hierarchical vision of civilizations, right, in which one superior civilization is meant to rule the world. The contemporary radical right wants to distance itself probably as radically as it can from exactly that notion. And to do so, it has adopted an overtly differentialist logic. Right? It's this idea that civilizations are differential, they are in fact literally incommensurable. and that the world and the value of the world is comprised precisely of this difference, and it is this difference that they want to try to maintain. My favorite quote, I'm probably going to mess the exact quote up a little bit here, is from Alain de Benoit, who says, difference is the glory of the world and liberalism is killing it. Right? So what we have here is an idea that differentialism is linked to civilizationalism, not in a way to articulate the universal superiority of any one civilization, although I think many, maybe even most people on the right would argue that in their view, their civilization is superior for them internally, but that does not mean, they argue, that it is superior externally or in any kind of universal sense. And this gives them a very, very different geopolitics, right? It tends to give them a civilizationalist geopolitics in which the world divides up into civilizational orders, or at least could conceivably be divided up into civilizational orders. The one thing I would say, because we're speaking here very briefly, right after Mr. Trump has made his very, very interesting inaugural speech and his comments afterwards, one of the most interesting things about that, I think, is he did not articulate America as part of the West. He articulated America as a return to almost, I would argue, a civilizational project, and indeed a trans-sovereign civilizational project. So I think there's no necessary contradiction here between nation and civilization. It is getting articulated in all kinds of different ways, but it is providing a profoundly different geopolitics.
Yes, I mean, maybe just to add on this, I mean, so what we look at in the book, there are different kinds of ideological projects on the radical right. There are, supranationalists, you've got ultranationalists, you've got regionalists, neo-imperialists, pan-regionalists, and so on, right? But what all these projects tend to have in common is a civilizationist backdrop to all of this, right? Somewhere down the line, and they conceive this in different ways, and the fault lines are come at different places and conceptualized in different ways. But ultimately, here, civilization becomes increasingly, right, a sort of like cultural normative backdrop against which these arguments are being made, and the argument these things are increasingly more predominant and important in international politics, right? Now, and so, like Michael said, in many ways this is cast as a response to the homogenizing forces of globalization and liberalism, right? What the right is trying to do here is to claim for itself some form of cultural diversity and pluralist in international politics, whilst at the same time, of course, pushing back against all forms of cultural hybrid and racial mixing and ethnic mixing and so on, right? So there are no natural hierarchy of race or ethnicity, but race and ethnicity matters, right? It's kind of segregationist argument also somewhere up the line, right? Basically, so Moroccan belongs in the Maghreb, right? France for the French, and no one is superior, but ultimately it's important that we are, right? And this is how you maintain diversity and pluralism in international politics. It's obviously not unproblematic, but it allows these forces to make alliances, right, across nationalists, supranationalists, left-wing, right-wing, global south, global north, people who oppose liberalism and kind of the allegedly sort of homogenizing force of liberalism. So it's quite powerful rhetorically as a set of arguments in that sense.
Jean-François, Michael, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.